Saturday, 2:20 p.m. I walked down to Coral's to tell her I do want a cake for my birthday. I don't really want a cake, but it's a nice thing to do, and nice is such a good hiding place. So is a long fringe. Auntie Coral's in her 60s. She's not really a relative, but I call her auntie because when my parents went away, I stayed with her, and subsequently she became like family to me. After her husband Clive died, she went away, and I missed her, but now she's back. However, since Clive left no will, she's found it necessary to take on a boarder to help financially. Clive and Coral owned the biggest cake shop in the mall. I imagine a baker's hours are punishing, but Clive and Coral seemed happy enough, and I suspect they were more than comfortable. When Clive died of a heart attack 7 years ago, everything changed. Apparently, he returned home from work one day, like he always did, sat down in his favourite chair, like he always did, but unlike other days, he complained of feeling bilious, which was unusual because Clive was the sort of chap who was never ill. By the time Coral returned with a bucket for Clive to be sick into, he was dead. All she heard was a loud crushing sound as his head hit a lamp after a massive convulsion. She still got the chair. Naturally, it's been reupholstered. After all, certain styles go out of vogue, but it's the same chair underneath. Mysteriously, Clive left no will, and since then Coral's had a terrible time getting her hands on any money. The house was in both names, but their bank accounts were under false appellations. I never found out why Clive kept false accounts, but it meant Coral went from being well off to a battler in 5 tragic seconds. Coral's place is on the eastern side of the street, 5 doors down from us, past Lexi 1, 2 and 3s. What are the odds of 3 girls the same age, all called Lexi, being neighbours, eh? I walk up the side of her house, sticking to the driveway that never feels the weight of a car anymore. Not since Clive died, anyway. Coral's in the backyard, hanging out washing. The sound of a radio fills out the rest of the picture. Coral's a round person. Round torso, round legs, round arms, round head, and tiny round eyes that constantly water little round tears. If Coral was an animal, she'd be a turtle. Her neck and head are the same width, so the neck joins the head without any hint of a jawline. Amigo, her cantankerous Sydney Selkie, ambushes me. Whether he's the original Amigo, I'm not sure. If he is, he's the Dorian Gray of the canine world, because he looks exactly the same as he did 7 years ago. His aggressive, high-pitched staccato barking signals my arrival. He's got a big dose of the little dog complex, that Amigo. Coral doesn't bother turning around to see who it is because Amigo stops barking the instant he sees me, so she knows whoever it is must be familiar. If I was a stranger, he would not stop barking until he was sure the stranger loved him. I'm the same. As usual, when one dog barks on Pleasant Avenue, all dogs on Pleasant Avenue bark. As usual, the Sorensen's dog barks the longest and the loudest. It sounds as though he's got an impala trapped in a nearby waterhole. Coral is pegging up the floral parachutes that pass as fashion for the elderly, plus some brown men's apparel, presumably Nev's clothes. I notice there's a higher standard of bloomer on her clothesline these days. I wonder if Coral and Nev well, you know. I put this unsettling thought aside and exchanged the usual platitudes. How is it? How's Amigo? Blah, 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 blah. I also mention that the party is now at my place and not the surf club. Even though Coral insists it's for the best, she rattles on and on about the pitfalls of entertaining people in your own home. Coral's not happy unless there's an impending disaster. If there isn't one, she creates one. I also half-heartedly agree to her idea of making me a cake shaped like a wave with a surfer on top. It sounds like a cake for a 12-year-old, but she's lonely and she shows affection through food. So what do? I give in. She prattles on for 10 more minutes about the sorts of foods we need, the types of glasses people like to drink from, and she also advises me on when to serve the various courses she's suggesting. If it wasn't for the pikelets she whipped up while we spoke, I don't think I could have hung in there, but I'm glad I did. Those warm pikelets served with jam and cream led me to one of the most important realizations of my life. If she hadn't made those pikelets, I would have gone home, and she would never have asked me if I heard the loud noise last night. I heard it. I thought a car had hit my fence, she said. Now, sometimes Pleasant Avenuers feign ignorance to gain information, but it's obvious Coral's in the dark. For once, I know what happened, so I offer my snippet of information, still not realizing the significance of the occasion. Mrs. Gumley drove through the front gates. Really, she says, and they got stuck on the bumper bar. Truly. It was so funny because Mr. Gumley spent almost an hour trying to get them off dressed in his pyjamas. I rarely say anything that makes Coral listen, but suddenly I've got her full attention. She's in the palm of my sweaty hand. Who told you this? She says. I saw it. Really? It woke me up, so I got out of bed and looked through my window. So, the Queen of Sheba drove through the gates, did she? Mr. Price. The moment I mention him, I lose her. That turd. Coral has invented names for all the people who live on Pleasant Avenue. Queen of Sheba is Mrs. Gumley. Turd is for Mr. Price. 95% of the time, if I say Mr. Price, she'll say turd, that turd, or he's a turd. He tell you this? Not really. Turd. Mr. Price? Turd. I saw Mr. Gumley. Amigo, obviously jealous I'm taking so much of Coral's attention away from him, suddenly drags himself across the grass on his stomach, his back legs trailing behind him as if they're badly injured. Whenever Amigo does anything cute in front of Coral, she completely loses her train of thought. Nevertheless, until I mentioned Mr. Price, Coral had hung on my every word. As I leave, I find Nev, the boarder, slouched in Clive's old chair, watching TV. Nev's dressed in a blue singlet and a pair of small green shorts. He has short grey hair, and both his arms are completely covered in florid tattoos. Never pick a fight with someone who is wearing work shorts and has more than 20 tats. If I narrow my eyes, I'd swear he was Paul Newman. Nev definitely has more than a passing resemblance to Paul Newman. He rises and greets me, grabbing my hand and crushing it with one of the firmest handshakes ever. Sandy? Nev? Satisfied he's killed my hand, or at least taught it a lesson it won't forget, he releases his python-like grip and recommences his TV viewing. I go on my merry way. That is, until Coral, who's followed me into the front yard via the back door, cuts me off at the gate. You inviting Nev to the party? She asked. He'd have heard everything we were talking about in the kitchen. Does he want to come? Think so. Whew, gee, my party is the hot ticket among the over 50s on Pleasant Avenue. Note well, Coral's reaction to my story about Mrs. Gumley encourages me to find out more about the Gumleys. The more detail, the more compelling my story will be. So I make it my duty to find out exactly why Mrs. Gumley drove her car through the gates. I want to be the authority on this incident. When someone wants to know anything about the Gumleys, I don't want them to go to Mr. Price. I want them to come to me.